Outstanding, red team, outstanding. Get your case of beer for that.
That, an unforgettable scene from Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Writing about it years later, New York Times film critic A.O. Scott said that sequence, in which a surfing-obsessed U.S. commander named Kilgore lays waste to a Vietnamese village, quote, could stand by itself as one of the best war movies ever. Over the years, Vietnam has inspired literally hundreds of movies, each portraying various aspects of the war and its aftermath. Those movies are a reflection of America's complicated relationship with Vietnam, a war that, as Ken Burns' ongoing documentary, The Vietnam War, makes clear continues to divide opinion. Joining me now to talk about the intersection of Hollywood and Vietnam is A.O. Scott, chief film critic for the New York Times. Tony, it's nice to have you here with us.
Great to be here.
There are so many films, and they take so many different views and approaches to this war, but is there a common thread that you see throughout these?
I think there is. I mean, I think that Vietnam didn't really begin to show up on screen in fictional feature films like Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter until a few years after it was over, until the later 70s. There was a little bit of a lag, I think, as the public tried to sort of to readjust and to grapple with it. I think that there are different ways that it's dealt with. I would say there are films that concentrate very much on the experience of the soldiers. You know, that take a very kind of close, ground level, kind of grunt's eye view of the situation in country and in combat, and that try for a kind of realism and in a way almost to sort of to remind viewers that there is this experience here, that there is this human level experience of men, very young men, fighting in this war that was so complicated, that was so poorly understood and badly explained in a way even to them. And then I think there are movies that try in different ways, and I would say Apocalypse Now is one of those, to try to get at some larger picture of the chaos, of the confusion, of the meaning of the war for the country as a whole, as well as for the military.
You talk about how some of the films are trying to portray the war experience, the combat experience. Then we have some that are looking at the experience of coming home.
Yeah.
Have we seen that with other wars, with Korea, World War II? Have we seen as much of the coming home experience, or is there something about Vietnam and that experience and the consequential coming home experience that was different?
I think there was something different. I mean, there is one of the great World War II or post-World War II movies is The Best Years of Our Lives, which is about veterans coming home and trying to readjust. But that kind of tells a story of men whose experience in combat, though it was terrible, was also meaningful and trying in a way to adjust to a reality that's passed them by. In the experience of the returning veterans of the Vietnam War is something else, because there's a war that did not end in victory, that did not end in glory. The people that they come home to don't necessarily want to hear about or think about or understand.
And certainly don't want to embrace the soldiers.
And don't want to embrace the soldiers. And I think that one of the really interesting movies about that experience is actually the first Rambo movie, First Blood. We think of the Rambo movie, the second Rambo movie called Rambo, where he goes back and gets revenge. Yeah. But First Blood is something else. It's about a man at odds with his own society, about someone trying to, in a way, reintegrate himself to a society that called on him to do these terrible things and now has no use for him and no place for him.
And very different from the remaining Rambo movies.
It is, and it's much closer in spirit to a kind of tragic Western than to a war movie.
How about the way that the movies depict the anti-Vietnam feeling in the United States as it evolved over the years?
I think that's a harder one, because I think that Hollywood really likes consensus. Hollywood tries to make movies for everybody and tries to find the thing that everybody can agree on in whatever it is that they're making movies about. And the Vietnam War is, for that reason, a really tough one. And one of the reasons I think that there's been so much focus on the experience of soldiers is because there's a feeling that we can all agree you know, that these guys are brave and are doing something, whatever the politics of it, that has a certain nobility to it. I think that there's been a lot more, I think, misunderstanding and maybe caricature of the anti-Vietnam movement. I mean, I think of Forrest Gump as an example of I think a very sort of misleading and inaccurate and sort of revisionist idea about what the whole protest against the war was about.
I'm in college during that whole period of time. I was a little too young to be involved in the Vietnam War, but I'm in college when that's happening. And again, you look at films like Forrest Gump, and I love Forrest Gump, it was great, but I was watching Forrest Gump saying, that's not what's going on my campus and around us.
Right.
You know, very different. Do you think the fact that, comparing World War II and Vietnam, one of the things you mentioned is that the Vietnam films didn't start coming out until later. World War II had World War II movies being made in the first year or two of our involvement in that war. So it was very different.
It was different. I mean, those movies in World War II, a lot of them were made, you know, with the participation and censorship of the military. The amazing kind of collaboration between the Office of War Information and the Hollywood studios, and great directors
they're bringing in
Frank Capra and John
Ford.
But I think with Vietnam, it was, you know, a televised war, so people were getting information and images of a kind that they certainly weren't getting during World War II in the newsreels and in the films. But I think in some ways the way that the war was reflected on screens while it was still going on was indirectly. I mean, in I think a movie like Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which is a Western, and which kind of amped up the bloodshed in a way that had not been seen on sort of mainstream Hollywood screens before. I think that was a sort of a reflection or a displacement of what people were seeing on their television screens and about what people were feeling about what was going on in Southeast Asia.
Do you think there will continue to be Vietnam films made the way we're seeing a continuation of World War II films being made?
I hope that there will be more, because I think that films can be a powerful way of dramatizing and understanding history, and I hope that filmmakers continue to seek out some of the more complicated and ambiguous and difficult experiences in history, as well as the ones that seem to have a lot more kind of clarity and sort of inspiration to them.
As you said, the power of films and filmmaking. Tony, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for spending some time with us. Appreciate it. Take care.